All right, so welcome to the video, guys. Welcome to this conversation. I have with me here Master Samwise from the Master Samwise channel.
Hello, good to be here, Pilgrim.
Nice. We've been trying to set this up for a while.
Yeah, kind of forgot about it for a little bit there.
Yeah, and also different time zones and things like that makes it kind of difficult, but we kind of found a way.
So because I know it's very early in the morning for you right now, and it's quite late at night for me.
Yeah, but in this moment we can partake in this conversation that I think is an important one to have because, well, for one thing, it's the conversation going on in the culture right now. Famously, on the surface, it just appears to be a conversation about masculinity and femininity, right? Which a lot of your videos are about. Do you mind, just in case people in my channel, they're not really aware of your work, do you mind introducing the kind of videos you talk about and most of the topics that you cover?
Yeah, for sure. So I have a pretty eclectic range of video topics that I've covered. The channel honestly started out just talking about Star Wars, like modern Star Wars. And then I made a video entitled Why Iroh is the Pinnacle, I believe, I think was the term I used, of masculinity. And that video blew up. To date, it has, I think, over 2 million views. And so that kind of changed the face of the channel where I went, there's really a market for this. People, want to see this sort of stuff. And so I started doing other videos about Avatar, and I started doing other videos about masculinity, including my Aragorn one. And when I was doing research for that, I stumbled across your video about Aragorn Pilgrim. So that was how I first found your channel, was your video about Aragorn's masculinity. And so, yeah, it's kind of gone from there. I've done, a number of videos about, how to write or not write good, strong women characters and just, what makes, men of fiction, a lot of them good men, what we learn from them, what we gain from these stories. And yeah, it's, so those are the types of videos I usually focus on now. It's like, what can we learn from them? Why these characters are so incredible? What, what kind of inspiration or maybe even cautionary tale they offer us. Just kind of, finding the meaning in fiction, especially right now, like you said, with our culture I guess different cultures, but worldwide culture so confused and lost in a lot of ways. It's like, it's amazing how we can find this real grounded footing in the realm of fiction.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I have a similar story on my channel as well. That Aragorn video that you mentioned unexpectedly blew up as well. And I didn't even want to make that video topic originally, actually. It was a friend of mine who asked. He's like, hey, why don't you talk about Aragorn as a good example of masculinity? And I'm like, all right, sure. I mean, no other video I was doing was working at the time. That was back when I had like 40 subscribers,
Yeah.
But surprisingly, it's like, wow, okay, people actually like. I at that time it was 2021, and I thought that the conversation was pretty much dead at that point. I thought everything had already been said. I thought people were sick to death about that conversation. But this was like, that was like 3 years ago. And no, that was just the beginning. People really need to have this conversation, not just about masculinity, but about femininity as well. And I think that the reason why it's such a prevalent conversation, other than the cultural issues and the political issues, which we don't have to get into, this also has to do with the fact that you mentioned different cultures, right? But there are universal aspects, right? Universal archetypes and universal story beats. And in storytelling all over the world, these heroic archetypes, whether for female characters or male characters, have been around for millennia, right? The warrior maiden, like Eowyn from Lord of the Rings, right? She's Mulan. She's reminiscent of Mulan, right? She's reminiscent of Bradamanchi and other very famous characters that are both in Asian and Western folklore. And I think it's the same reason why the same way that people like to watch these videos over and over again about masculinity. A good example is you have your Aragorn video that has around 400,000 views, right? And my Aragorn video, or like 500,000 views, right? And my Aragorn video has about that same amount of views. People seem to like to watch and consume media over and over again about the same things. But
absolutely.
Right, exactly. Which makes it easy for us, right? Because then, as content creators, it takes less creativity than you might think sometimes. But this tendency is actually much wider, and you can see this on a whole narrative scale. So a good example is Avatar: The Last Airbender, right? Star Wars, Lord of the Rings. These are essentially the same story over and over again, right? Especially Avatar and Star Wars. Would you agree? Like, have you noticed how very similar these stories are?
Oh yeah, I mean, you could say that about a lot of stuff, right? Everything from Marvel to Star Wars, to, Lord of the Rings. Like, they have all these incredibly similar elements, right? You have the hero's journey that Frodo and Aang and Luke all embark on, right? You have the great, evil empire with the Dark Lord at its head, whether that be, Sidious or Sauron or Ozai or whoever, right? So there's these incredibly common elements within these fantasy stories that resonate with us. I mean, that's what makes them, in some parts, so timeless, because they're familiar, right? They're comfortable, but they're also just meaningful, right? This is coming from a Catholic worldview, but they reflect reality. Yeah. Right? Whereas, like, the world is ruled by the evil one, and we're supposed to be fighting against him. Whether or not the creators, share that Christian or Catholic worldview, they most likely don't, at least, with the exception of Tolkien. But it's still, they still reflect that reality. And so I think that's why, I'll talk about, and my video that I'm hopefully publishing tomorrow, like, that fiction and fantasy are so very real, because they come from the human mind and the human experience, and I think that's why we, at least in part, why we see these fantasy stories being so similar.
Yeah, I definitely agree. Being a Catholic myself as well, I also do agree that there is a greater metaphysical reality that these stories are touching. But also, you also have a repeated human experience that's very physical, that happens throughout history. So, for instance, the hero's journey, that's basically like a codified mythologization of the experience of going to war, right? For many men throughout history, either as conscripts or volunteers, right? Because you have the normal world, right? They're in their home, they're in their farm, or whatever that was. Their case in history, and then something happens, right? The Pope calls for a crusade, or the Germans invade Belgium, right? And your government declares war on Germany, and so then you enter the military. You find the mentor figure, right? In the older officers, they train you. You enter through this dark period of the soul. You go through experiences. If God willing, you survive. You come back home a changed man, right? That's the hero's journey, basically. And it's just a mythologization of this repeated experience that people have gone through over and over again. And the reason why a lot of these stories aren't original is not because there's a creative bankruptcy, but it's because our lives aren't that original. Like, everything we lived through, someone else has lived through a similar experience. And so these stories become a way for you to pass wisdom and pass information to later generations. And and going back to the masculinity and femininity, the whole thing about the best way to be a man or a woman in the world, that's also communicated through stories. And that's why I guess that is, and we've lost that a little bit for ideological reasons or for whatever reasons in the mainstream culture globally, I'd say. And that's why people are so hungry for videos like ours that try to recapture. Because all we really did was recapture chivalrous elements, right? And you applied that to Iroh, and I applied that to Aragorn first, and that created, and that had that changed the history of our channels, and that just goes to show how people are hungry for this collected wisdom of the past.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I love the point that you made, where, you know, we're all living through something that someone else has lived through before, right? Very, very few human experiences are going to be truly unique, and you know, and so it's really kind of astounding then that we even have these incredibly different yet so similar stories, right? Where the themes of ATLA and Star Wars and Lord of the Rings can be quite similar, and yet the stories are vastly different in their settings and their worlds and their characters. Even if, you know, there are tons of parallels to be drawn between them. And like the video that I'm was finished editing tonight, I draw a parallel between, you know, Zuko and King Theoden, right? And they're like learning to hope. And, you know, so it's like that's, it's just because I've been thinking about that, because I made a Theoden video recently, and now I'm making another video about, you know, Iroh and Zuko and stuff. And it's just like, oh man, like this stuff exists, you know, these themes exist between stories, and that's so cool. And yeah, as far as like, you know, why it's important, it's I think largely what you touched on briefly is that, you know, the mainstream culture, like what we've lost is basically living for each other. If you ask me, right? Everyone's told to live for themselves, to find what's best for you and pursue that. And that's all so shallow and at the end of the day meaningless. And that's what I think, that's what really bugs people, and I think that's why my video about the strong women struck a huge chord, is because I really harped on the fact that these characters who are written just for themselves, they're just written to be self-actualized, and like that's their entire character arc, is learning that like, awesome. No, you're great. Yeah. And that's so boring. And so, I mean, it is just shallow and self-aggrandizing and just pretty much meaningless. It's preachy without having any actual value behind it. And because, you know, humans aren't made for ourselves. We're not made for like whatever, you know, power we can grab onto. We're made for love. And that's what modern Hollywood just can't seem to wrap their heads around.
Well, yeah, because human beings are made by more than one person, right? Two people get together and make a person, right? When a man loves a woman,
exactly.
And so, like, we are plurality, right? Given becoming one, and then we make other pluralities, right, of people. And so, if we just stay with ourselves and we die, we lose all meaning, but we also lose all, and as a consequence, we lose the will to live. And I think that's the problem with a lot of these self-centered stories that we try to tell ourselves but that's also the good thing about it, is that it can't go on indefinitely. At some point, the same way that the ring, right, and evil in Lord of the Rings destroys itself, right, with it's precisely the evil within Gollum that then helps destroy the ring. Then I think it's the same thing with this negative feedback loop as people consume themselves, right? But you mentioned how the stories have similar story beats and themes. They also have very similar narrative structure. So this is more visible with Avatar and Star Wars, I'd say, right? So you have the evil empire, and you have the plucky resistance fighters, and you even have like that scene with the mentor where the hero goes out in the middle of somewhere far removed to learn from some ancient spiritual master, right? Yoda and the guru. And then they have a vision about their friends. And it's like, no, don't save your friends. Complete your training. But then they go anyway, right? And you have the redemption of a former antagonist who was pursuing the hero at first, but then joins the hero in defeating the Dark Lord, right? And Darth Vader and Zuko. But at the same time, the differences that occur, even though the similarities are very much there, are differences according to historical circumstances from which each of the stories take place. Because, so for instance, Lord of the Rings having been written after World War II or during that time period, and Star Wars being written in the 70s and Avatar being written in the 2000s. What we see is, for instance, Avatar is more conscious of the human element of the invader, right, than either Star Wars or Lord of the Rings. Lord of the Rings, you have the orcs, and in Star Wars, the Empire is very cartoonish, and the Imperial, like, you don't think, oh, how can we redeem the Empire, right? It just has to be destroyed. While in Avatar, the redemption of the Fire Nation as a civilization is very much like how they solve the crisis. And in Star Wars, while Lord of the Rings is more aware of the weight of history in driving the present conflict, which would make sense for Tolkien as a British infantryman, right, in World War One, and with Star Wars, it's more aware of the injustice at the core of a corrupt political machine, right, which makes sense being written in the 70s. So in this way, even though you have these stories that keep repeating themselves, the reason why newer iterations tend to resonate more with the current people is because what the artist does, what the writer does, is try to communicate these ancient ideas and this ancient wisdom into, which is universal, and fit it into the particular experience that a person is living in their time period, right? So I guess if people sometimes people ask me for advice on writing stories, and I say that that's pretty much how you do it. Like you have to know when to deviate from this wisdom, so that you can address new issues of the day, but also bringing us back to this greater human experience that even though things are different in our modern era, they're not that different, right? We're all still humans and we're all still living according to those human needs. Which brings us back to the corruption of the male and female character that we see in the culture now. Like they're trying to change everything. They're trying to change the fundamental nature of how men and women work, and trying to create narratives that reflect that change that they believe is happening, which I don't think it is. But in the end, they're not actually, their lack of understanding of history makes them not realize that they're not actually deviating from stories that have been written for centuries. Like, so here's an example. There's a European, right, white, female badass warrior woman, and then she falls in love with a Muslim man, right, from the Middle East, who's also a warrior, but then he gets trapped by a wizard in a tower, and she has to go save him, right? This kind of seems like a Netflix story, right? Like,
depending where you're going with that, I was almost going to say it sounded like a Hallmark movie.
Yeah,
but
right. But something that was written right now, right? Like it's yeah. But the thing is, like, this story is it's Orlando Furioso, right? Written by an Italian in the 1500s, and this is Bradamanci, right? And her romance with I think his name is Ruggio, who was a Saracen warrior. So this is a very old, right, story written right in the beginning of colonial times, and meanwhile, people think that they're being so subversive and so risque, right? Oh no, what if the female saves the male? What if the male is in distress, right? Oh, like that's so unique, but it's actually not. So, people just have to understand that there is no real revolution. when it comes to storytelling. Like nothing that you can write, or very little that you can write, will change thematically from what has probably been written before. And that's the thing. The problem that most people have with these new characters is not the fact that they change, right, something. It's not that, oh no, the female has to always be in distress. We can't have that. We can't have a strong woman. The issue is that they actively feel like they hate the characters that have become classic and beloved characters. So the issue is not that Rey is a strong character. The issue is that Luke was utterly destroyed and humiliated. Like everything he stood for, everything that he represented was treated with such, like, I felt kind of like a hate.
Contempt.
Yeah, contempt.
Yeah.
And
absolute contempt.
Yeah. So what do you think about that?
Yeah, so I think that really comes down to basically modern filmmakers, modern studios not loving traditional values, even ones as simple as like bravery and self-sacrifice, where they don't really get it. And these, characters like Luke, or I think of another example. I know, like, I haven't actually seen the Terminator movies, but I know I've seen a video talking about Sarah Connor from, Terminator 2, and then she was her character was assassinated in the, whenever it was rebooted, or the late sequel, whatever that came out in recent years, because she was, in Terminator 2, she was a kick-ass mother, but she was still a mother. And, then she ends up resenting it, being a mother and everything. And she's bitter and broken and everything in the late ones. And, you can see this again in Star Wars with Obi-Wan Kenobi. I know there's, other examples of plenty of old male heroes. Indiana Jones, who just got, shredded in his own 5th movie just this year or last year. And it's, there really is this kind of contempt for these older heroes who, weren't perfect, of course, but they meant something to people. And I don't know if it was because they meant what modern filmmakers believe to be the wrong thing, or if it was just the fact that they're old, right? They're from an older generation, and I feel like there really is a sense that right now, that like stuff that happened before 2000 is no good. And this is a bit of a tangent, but you see this with I don't know if you've seen stuff about like trad wives, right? That's a thing now, right? People just they decide to be a housewife, and they dress like it's they dress in fairly traditional dresses and outfits and bake bread and just care for their home and their husband, their children, whatever. Which you do what you want to do. That's great. But I've seen comments calling that fascist, and it's like not everything that existed before 1970s was fascist. Like it's just it's this incredibly weird way to view the past. I feel is so pervasive in just modern thought. And anything that doesn't conform to a specific worldview gets crammed and crushed into a little box. That's kind of my off the cuff thoughts on that.
I'm so glad that you brought up the fact that it's called fascist, because for one thing I was going to say that. I even pulled up an article that I wanted to cite now, but also that's my next video actually, of why exploring why there's this tendency, especially of journalists, but also of a lot of people from educated backgrounds, of calling everything fascist, right? From The Lion King to Lord of the Rings to I don't know, even Star Trek, like Star Trek for crying out loud, is considered fascist by anyone, like can be considered fascist. And the reason is basically, do you know the intellectual, the Italian intellectual called Umberto Eco? Are you familiar with him? Okay, so Umberto Eco, he wrote an essay which is very influential called Fascism, right? You are fascism, or universal fascism. And in this essay, he made the worst possible definition of fascism imaginable, where he tries to explain why fascist movements in the 30s were so different from each other and so varied. So like in Germany, they were more neo-pagan and anti-Christian, while in Italy, it was less so and stuff like that. In some iterations, they were more capitalistic, and others they were more socialistic, etc. And his explanation, but I think he fundamentally misunderstood fascism, is that it's an undefined, obscure, and very vague sentiment or mood that makes fascism. And to be fascist, you don't really have to adhere to a core set of tenets or political beliefs. You just have to be similar to another fascist group, right? And so, like, you don't have to have all the attributes that an archetypal fascist group will have. You can have just some, and that's enough for you to be fascist, right? And so right there, if you have a few if you have some things in common, that's enough to be a fascist. But also, he also says how, and he ends the essay by saying how fascism, since it's based on this traditionalist, he thinks, which it isn't. Fascism is actually enlightenment and progressive in its day, but he thinks that he associates any sort of traditional thought and any sort of deviation from not only just enlightenment thought, but the progressive tendency of history to be the fascist impulse returning. So just wanting to go back is fascist, or just wanting traditional values is fascist. And it's also so pervasive that it can be in a talk show, it can be in random aspects of culture, it can be in the person down the street who just doesn't like the fact that Luke Skywalker was destroyed, stuff like that. And that can be fascist. So and we have to always call it out. We have to always point our finger and stuff like that. And that definition that really caught on, and you can see even in articles people citing the Fascism essay by Umberto Eco, which is total nonsense. Fascism is actually a political doctrine. It actually has tenets. It actually has it's about the worship of the nation state, right? So it's and it was Mussolini himself said that it wasn't reactionary, that it was progressive. He believed. This is the funny thing. He believed that he was going to win against the socialist governments and the liberal democratic governments that he was fighting against, because his doctrine was newer, right? It was a 20th century doctrine, while liberal democracy and socialism was around in the 19th century. So he thought that just by the progressive march of history, he was guaranteed a victory in World War II. And he says that in his essay, The Doctrine of Fascism, where he and Giovanni Gentili helped formulate that political doctrine. And so Umberto Eco completely mischaracterizes, right, what the founders of this political doctrine, this very evil political doctrine, believed, and which is probably because he took this opportunity to maybe use this fascism term against political opponents, maybe, but also I think in his case, since he grew up in World War II, I think he was kind of traumatized, right, by the fascist government that he grew up under, and I think he kind of projected that trauma to everyone else, like to the broader political, right, the broader political context, but that kind of caught on for various reasons. But anyway, I want to set the article that I was talking about. I'm going to maybe put it on screen. But there's an article in CNN, right, that came out some years ago, which says, why kids love fascist cartoons like Paw Patrol and Thomas, right? Thomas the Tank Engine, right? The talking train, right? Oh
my gosh.
Yeah. Like this is, and apparently the article's calling Paw Patrol fascist, like, there's another one as well. It's really funny. Like it's hilarious. But the ending says everything. Like I'm just gonna set the last paragraph. Okay, quote. Here's an idea for the creative team behind Paw Patrol and Thomas. Should they want to broaden their appeal to parents without alienating their fan base, Ryder and Sir Topman Hatt, the authority figures who are white male characters, that's why it's fascist, are replaced by their equally domineering sisters. This, in turn, boosts the social status of all the non-male characters. Children could still get the satisfaction of immersing themselves in an orderly universe where rules are rules and everyone is in his or her place, just without the white guy on top. right? End quote. So there you have the whole thing in a nutshell, right? She starts this article, this essay, saying how how Thomas is a pre-modern corporate totalitarian dystopia, right? It's horrible, like everything is so orderly. But if we just have an equally domineering woman in charge, then that's going to be fine. That'll
solve all the problems.
Exactly. Yeah. Fascism is dead. Yeah.
People tend to view things through a lens, right? Everyone has their own lens that they view the world through, right? And there are, I feel this is just me speculating, based on what I see in YouTube comments and articles like this, but there is a growing number of people who view the world through an increasingly shrinking lens, where basically everything, every piece of media or content, every book they read or show they encounter or tweet they see gets viewed through this lens, right? It gets judged one way or the other, right? Is this fascist or is this progressive? As if, like you pointed out, fascism wasn't at its time progressive, as all schools of thought have been. At one time, everything was a new school of thought.
Exactly.
And I think, when you talk about Mussolini, is like, I'm going to win because this is the new thing. This is the march of history. And I feel like that's how people think now.
Yeah.
They're like, well, we're new. Like these are the modern values. These are what are going to win. And they're not, because eventually they'll get replaced by something else which thinks it's going to win. Yeah. And what will continue to last are real values.
Exactly.
But yeah, I mean, just the idea of calling, Sir Topham Hatt a fascist because he's a white guy in charge. You could apply the same thing to, I don't know, every United States president ever, including the current one, if you so desire to. But I get the feeling the writer of this article would not want to. And she would be inaccurate, because that's just not the system we have in place.
Yeah, exactly.
But it's so silly to me that people just continue to, for lack of a better term, call names on the internet and think they've made a point.
Yeah.
It's it's one of the more frustrating things of doing what I do, not for a living. This is not my job. My YouTube channel is very much my hobby, but I'm very invested in it. I care a lot about it, and I, reading comments and seeing people who just very clearly think of the world in kind of two terms through this one little lens that either it fits in one box or it fits in another box, and never the twain shall meet. And it's kind of disheartening. But there's also lots of, there's more positives to it too. Anyhow.
Yeah, I think the positive thing about universal values is that includes everybody, right? No matter your political stance. So, like, the good thing about stories like Star Wars and Avatar is that everyone can enjoy them, right? Whether progressive or more conservative or Catholic or non-Catholic, everyone can enjoy some of these stories. And I think that's the failure of these newer stories coming out, is that nobody enjoys them, not even people who share political beliefs with the people making them, right? Like, that's why these stories are tanking. And that's why, like, this last year in 2023, like, every movie has been a flop, basically. You also have different economic factors going on, right? They're watching more movies at home. Theaters aren't really a thing. The whole model that Hollywood is based on, which is based on the box office, is kind of going away. Yeah, of course, we have these macroeconomic trends going on. But also, if the stories were good, people would consume these stories at home, which they're not really either. Yeah?
People did show up to the theaters, though. We had at least 3 movies break $1 billion at the box office.
And
Super Mario Brothers.
Oh yeah, Super Mario Brothers.
Barbie and Oppenheimer. I believe Oppenheimer all broke $1 billion. And there's probably 1 or 2 more that I'm not thinking of. But just those off the top of my head. So people are showing up. It's just, I think it's a large part that Hollywood just
garbage. Yeah.
There's that. The movies suck for the most part. I mean, Indiana Jones 5, I don't know if you've seen it, but it is an absolute travesty of a movie. Even without assassinating Indiana Jones' character and just making him yet another crotchety old man who gets replaced by a younger, female. And even putting that aside, the movie's garbage. It's poorly written. It makes no damn sense. It's a bad movie. It's just a bad movie. So there's that factor. And then there's the factor that, so those 3 movies, right? They were all written for an audience, and they were written to cater to that audience. Barbie was written to cater to women.
Mm-hmm.
You know, girls anywhere from like, you know, teenage girls all the way up to, you know, women, middle-aged women, or even beyond.
Mm.
And it was brilliant. Like, and they just wrote it for that that audience.
Mm-hmm.
They're like, hey, come see this movie. And it turns out a lot more women, would you believe it, are interested in seeing the Barbie movie, the first Barbie movie that's come out, the first live-action Barbie movie anyway, that's come out in theaters, as opposed to seeing the 87th Marvel movie that's now boasting a new, exciting female lead.
Yeah. The critical drinker.
Who would have thought it?
Yeah, exactly. A critical drinker, he says this as well, right? That instead of trying to make movies that are traditionally for men and men enjoy them, cater to women, you just make movie for women. And then that way you make money from the guys watching the film made for guys and the women watching movies made for them. And then everybody makes money and everyone's happy. Everybody gets what they want. But I think the problem now is that Hollywood has, and this is the good side, I think, of Hollywood going off the rails, is that the reason why it's going off the rails is because it has monopolized global culture. And I really mean global culture.
Yeah.
For a very long time, for like several decades, almost 100 years at this point. And this monopoly has made them think that they own the culture, that they make the culture. They don't realize that the reason why they were able to rise to this position was because they were tapping into a demand that was there. They think that they could create the demand, right? A lot of monopolies, they get too big for their boots in this regard. And,
absolutely.
But then when they don't start supplying for the demand, their days are pretty much done, and then they're replaced by other things in the market, which I think is starting to happen now. Anime is the big one, but you also have Korean dramas, and you have people on the internet from all over the world making great content on YouTube. But even like animation stuff like that. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I was gonna say, well, you know, Hollywood, like you said, Hollywood monopolizes culture, and I absolutely agree. But the problem is they're not a true monopoly. For their problem, right? Their problem for them, for their own profit margins, was that they're not a true monopoly, right? As in, they don't own storytelling, right? If you've got someone with a monopoly on steel, they're the only place people can buy steel, right? Then they can basically set whatever price they want because people need it.
Right.
People need stories. Absolutely. Yes. 100%. We all need stories. We've needed stories for millennia. We will continue to need stories until the end of time.
Yeah.
But Hollywood's not the only one who can provide them, right? They were the ones with the budgets to reach tons of people and really put their, really market and get the word out. But yeah, like you said, at the end of the day, people can find indie films, they can find animes, they can, watch Korean dramas, just other foreign films. They can play video games. They could maybe read a book.
Yeah.
So
I forgot about books.
Hollywood, right? Hollywood simply doesn't have a monopoly on storytelling.
Yeah.
So, and that is, I think, what they're finding out.
Yeah, exactly. And if there's anything I think to learn about this is that stories are bigger than you. Right, like you're not really writing the story, right? The story is writing you in a lot of ways, because
that's what Tolkien said about Lord of the Rings. He said about Middle Earth. He said, "I didn't create it; I discovered it."
Yeah, and I think that's very true. I think for one thing, it's because stories, they reflect a greater reality, but they also we grow up on stories, right? That's how we're raised, like that, right? And because that's how you transmit. Moral values to kids, but also little lessons like don't lie, don't accept candy from strangers, right? And a lot of these fables, right? Hansel and Gretel and stuff like that. That's what they're trying to impart. And so as a result, what you're doing is civilization itself is a narrative, right? It's making sense of a sequence of events, right? That's what civilization is, a broader sequence of events. You do this, you have a set of duties that you inherit and that you have to do and stuff like that. And stories, they try to give meaning to that. If you mess with the fabric of it, not only do you risk making a story nobody likes, but if a mistaken idea about how reality works catches on, you can potentially ruin lives, right? And I think this lack of humility is something that can actually is a problem. Like if you try to tell kids that being selfish is a good thing, or getting them against their parents or whatever, like this, that's the fabric of society that you're talking about.
You kind of hit the nail on the head. There's modern stories they teach us terrible lessons, basically.
As a father, right? Which one do you think is the worst offender? A kids film that you think you would not want your kids to watch that came out recently?
I guess it's not strictly a kids film, but I know that 2020 Mulan is just terrible because it's a horrible subversion of what the original Disney film was, and obviously Disney didn't create Mulan. At least I don't think they did. But the original film is all about her overcoming her natural weaknesses and finding other ways to be effective, right? To to be a leader. And in the new one, it's just like, oh, she's capable. She just needs to accept that she shouldn't hold herself back. And that something we see time and again, where it's just like, no. We're not perfect. We don't need to accept how perfect we are. We need to accept how broken we are and move beyond that. But yeah, I don't know. My kids don't really watch anything that comes out nowadays,
Disney,
except for Bluey.
Oh, okay.
Bluey's like the only currently running thing that they count, which is one of the most wonderful shows ever. Other than that, we generally have them watching, Pixar, from like the golden age of Pixar. That's pretty much it. I will say one movie that actually came out, I'm not sure when did Monsters University come out? 2017, 2018, something like that. And it's not a great movie. It's a good movie. So were it not for its predecessor being arguably the best Pixar movie ever, it would be a much better movie in my mind, I'm sure. But it has a really powerful message that is missing in so many modern films. And that message is sometimes you're not good enough.
Yeah.
And that's just how things are. Mike wants to be a scarer. That's all he's ever wanted. And he's just not scary. And so he has to find something else to do. And I think that's a really, really cool message to have in a kid's film, where it's like you might want something more than anybody else, but through no fault of your own, you're just not cut out for it. I mean, how many kids, especially growing up in the United States, I and so many of my peers dreamed of playing professional sports. That's what we wanted to do, right? Sports are amazing. I could play sports for my job when I get older. This is amazing. And then, of course, I'm not good enough to play baseball or football for a career. I'm, an incredibly average person, just in every aspect, physically. So yeah, it's just not happening. No matter how hard I might work at it, and not that I did work hard enough anyway, but even if I did work harder than anybody else, it still wouldn't happen. And that's a life lesson that most people, or at least a lot of people, have to learn at some point. And having that actually imparted to a kid in a kid's film, even if they don't totally absorb it, but it's there, it's in their mind. I think that was really neat. So that's something that I was like, let's have that sort of movie come back.
I'm so glad you brought up Monsters University. For one thing, this is a message that I think everyone, especially in our generation, can really get behind, because we were sold the whole thing of like, your dreams can come true kind of thing, right? From the 90s. And I always wanted to be a soldier. I tried to join the Brazilian army. That didn't work. I tried joining the French Foreign Legion. That didn't work. But I have some issues. I have some genetic issues and stuff like that. And it's just not going to happen. No matter how much I tried, no matter how much I went for it, it's not going to happen. And I did have to try to figure out something else to do with my life, and that was difficult. Like, that can be like this dream has been part of your identity, right, for so long. This and it defines things about you didn't even realize, that when you have to give it up, you have to. It can be a brutal process, but and Masters University codifies that in a story format for kids, but also for adults, in a way that helps you process these things. And that's the point of stories. Now, Monsters University has another film from Disney, another animated film from Disney, that came out around the same time with the exact opposite message, which just goes to show how that was like Disney in transition, I think, from having good messages to kind of going off the rails. And I'm talking, of course, about Zootopia. Now, Zootopia has a good message against racism and ethnic prejudice. Like, I like that part of the story. But the idea that a bunny can become a cop, right, and beat the crap out of, like, these bigger animals, right? And that one moment where she meets that fox that pretends to be a baby fox, right? and he's dressed like an elephant. And she's like, "You want to be an elephant? You can be an elephant." Right? Have you seen that film? Have you seen Zootopia?
Oh, many times.
Yeah.
Many times.
It's a good film, but that it's wrong. Like, no, a fox can't be an elephant. Like you can't be whatever you want to be. Like, there is a greater reality that's going to, and that film doesn't address that reality. What do you think?
No, not so much.
Yeah.
I kind of forget about that theme of the film because it kind of gets left in the dust a little bit after that.
Yeah.
Where it goes just kind of more on her journey of Judy's journey of just getting her eyes open to the reality of the situation and just how, her idealistic world that she's created just simply doesn't exist. And you could maybe make the argument that her you can be whatever you want to be is part of that package that kind of gets shattered. But it doesn't. Yeah, it doesn't. But that, you're right. That doesn't specifically get addressed really at all. I think it. So that there's kind of two parts of it, and I like talking about things in terms of. Oh crap! I forgot the word. But basically, you have one spectrums, right? I like talking about spectrums because talking about virtue and vice a lot. There's vice on either end. You got virtue in the middle. So right, and I think that so many conversations about their culture, people are on one end of the spectrum, people are on the other end of the spectrum, and if someone changes their mind, they just swing to the other end. Right? No one stops in the middle, and so there's the attitude that the fox has, whose name I'm blanking on in the middle. When my wife sees this, she's gonna be very mad that I forgot the fox's name. Nick. His name is Nicholas Wilde. There we go. I remembered it, honey. Anyhow, so he basically tells Judy, you'll never be a cop. You'll just be a bunny. He's like, I'm a fox. I do this. You're a bunny. You do that. That's it. That's the truth. And she's like, no, I can be whatever I want to be. You can be whatever you want to be. You don't have to be a fox. And I think that's a good message, right? You don't have to be what the world tells you are. Right? That's good. But then you swing to the other end of the spectrum, and it's like, you can be whatever you want to be. It's like, well, neither of those is really totally true, right? You don't have to be what the world thinks you are, what the world tells you have to be, but you also can't be anything, right? You can have dreams, you can have goals, but some of them just aren't going to be realistic, most likely. And so, you have to be prudent and you have to be cautious and realistic in some sense.
Yeah, I agree. I think Aristotle says, right, that virtue is a mean between two vices, right?
Golden mean. Yep. Yeah. No, that's a very, if you talk about themes in media, that's a very common theme throughout all my videos as I talk about the golden mean.
Yeah. I think one film that came out recently that's so bad for kids that you probably didn't even cross your radar, which is it was the Pixar film that came out some years ago, Turning Red. Have you heard of that film?
Yeah, my wife and I watched that not too long after it came out, and I think I described it as a pile of panda poo.
Yeah. I think that's yeah, and which is funny because it's talking about like different cultures, and it's trying to broaden the horizons. Because it's exploring a Chinese family in Canada. But really, it's crapping all over traditional Chinese values, and it's saying like, no, like this modern progressive, right? Anglosphere progressivism. That's the true, right? That's the true religion in a way. Like this is the way that things should be. And your traditional Chinese values. You're a mother who lived according to Confucian beliefs, to Confucian traditions. Well, screw you, But at the same, sorry, go ahead.
A myriad of problems with that movie.
Yeah.
For one thing, I'd be like, I didn't really like it, and people would respond, well, it wasn't made for you. It's like, it was made for. So who was it made for? 12-year-old Chinese girls who live in Toronto. Maybe we expand that to be like all tween or tweens or teen girls. Pixar has never done that. Pixar does not write movies for a very tight, specific demographic. Pixar makes movies for families. That's what they've always done. Yeah. Right. So
that's where the money
them
is.
making.
That's where all the
saying
money
like
is.
the movie isn't made for you. Right. It's just like that's absurd. That's not what you should do. You should make. At least if you're Pixar, because it's what you've always done, you should make movies for everyone.
Again, the universal story. Yeah.
And then there's exactly like you were saying, where it's just crapping on traditional beliefs because that's the thing to do today. And then just so many issues with the actual storytelling, where like the mother's whole arc is basically no, this is bad, no. And then in about 5 minutes at the end of the movie, she just completely changes her mind and her beliefs and everything, and she's fine.
And she's wrong because she lived a life of service, right? She lived a life of service. Yeah. She followed what her mother had to say, and then she tried to do the same thing for her daughter. And her daughter wins by twerking in front of her mother and showing that being selfish is the right thing to do. Is right. And the funny thing is, we're talking about universal stories. Confucian values are very similar to the values that we had in the West, right? The whole thing about service and treating others as you would like to be treated and stuff like that. You do have that in Confucian values, duty and stuff like that, and self-sacrifice. And so if you think about it, these traditional values, whether they're Chinese or Western, that a lot of these newer films are trying to completely crap on, it's not that they're trying to crap on traditional values because what they're trying to do is they're trying to replace one universal reality that we've experienced in the past with another universal reality that can be applied to, a white girl somewhere in Beverly Hills, to an immigrant family in Canada. It's right to everyone, right? And they're trying to create this new, different story. They're trying to affect reality by creating a new universal story to apply to everybody.
Yeah, I think the problem with modern values is that they change incredibly rapidly. You just what is accepted one year is in the gutter the next, and that's what happens. You don't have a source for any value beyond some vague sense of nicety or permissiveness.
That's why we're in postmodernity now. It's because what happened is with the advent of modernity and the idea that history moves, that progress is inevitable. I do believe that progress is a thing. I think if we sacrifice enough, if we can make things better. But the assumption that progress is inherent to history, it's an inherent part of the historical process, and it happens, and it's inevitable, and you have to be on the right side of history. It's not about fighting for progress. It's about getting on the progress train. Right? Mm-hmm. And just riding to victory. And if you're on the other side of the train, you're on the wrong side of history. That idea necessarily destroyed itself into postmodernism. Because postmodernism, what it did was it applied the logic of modernity on itself. So what happens is, what happens if traditions are antiquated and progress is always the way to go and we have to question tradition? What if that idea becomes the traditional idea? What if after a couple of centuries that becomes the tradition? Well, then that means that if you want to be progressive in that sense, then you have to question that progressive narrative, which is what happened with postmodernism, where they started questioning the values of modernity and saying, no, like there is no utopia, there's only structures of power, and we have to deconstruct everything, we have to destroy everything, which leads to deconstruction from Jacques Derrida. The idea that we have to emancipate by being critical about everything. Right. And what a lot of these films are doing, a lot of these stories, they're following this. They're not even modern. It's not even modern values anymore. It's what they're doing is they're trying to deconstruct older values, older stories, to try to then break free from them. Because the idea is that injustice comes from social structures, right? It's not like a natural force in the world. It's not that unfairness and harsh reality is part of broader reality that just sometimes isn't fair. It's that it's all the result of social injustices. So we have to get rid of injustice by seeing where in society it's manifesting and then getting rid of that aspect in society. And so that's why we have to deconstruct, good male role models, right? Because to get rid of the tyrannical man, we have to then deconstruct masculinity, etc. So a good example of deconstruction would be, Aragorn has to kill the orc babies, right? Because it has to genocide the orcs, right? Okay, so Aragorn, he's a genocidal monster, actually. Why is that deconstruction? Because what you're doing is you're using the elements in the text, The Lord of the Rings, to then try to supposedly reveal a darker element in the text that is not really considered, right? And so supposedly what you're doing is you are then deconstructing the text by showing that the superficial values of the text is not really what it's defending. There's a darker side to it, right? So in this case, having the orcs dehumanized, quote unquote, because they're not even human, but having the orcs displayed as this like force for evil, then kind of implies that the only way for Aragorn to be a good king is if he kills all the orc babies. You get what I'm saying?
So I have one question really.
Yeah.
When I don't read or think a lot about postmodernity, and maybe I should more, but in your opinion, what would you say is the goal of postmodern thought?
Emancipation, supposedly. So freedom, right? So the idea is, I could be wrong. People can tell me down in the comments if I'm wrong. But the idea is that like utopia is, since injustices come from society, right? If you just deconstruct society, then justice will just manifest.
So anarchy?
Well, some of them, there is somewhat of an anarchic element, but it's not really just anarchy. It's the idea. It's just justice. Right? They're after justice. They're after justice will, because justice is a natural force. It's Rousseau. You know Rousseau, the noble savage? Are you aware with Rousseau? The natural state of nature? Okay, so Rousseau, he wrote about the state of nature. And he believed that the state of nature was awesome. So human beings, when there was no society, no civilization, all we did was, frolic in the woods and pick up fruits in the trees, and everything was fair and just, and we were all equal. Then what happened was some douchebag, right, decided to put up a fence and say that plot of land was his, and that was the source of civilization, and all the wars, all the injustices, inequality, hunger, like all that manifests from that one douchebag who decided to put a fence. I'm not even kidding. This is literally what he says. And if the other people didn't believe him, if they weren't so gullible, if they just pulled up the fence and said, don't believe this imposter, the earth belongs to no one and the fruits of the earth belong to everybody, then we would still be living in this idyllic, state of nature. And so if that's what you believe, then destroying society and destroying the fabric of social values and stuff like that will then manifest this wonderful state of nature. Right.
Interesting.
Yes. So,
go ahead. I feel like that is in direct opposition to
reality.
The idea of like socialism, where we will finally achieve human freedom if we just will give the government control over everything and let them share it among us.
Well, it's not, because socialism is supposed to be a transitionary state. So the true goal of socialism, yes. So they're trying to achieve the Rousseau noble savage utopia, which did inspire Karl Marx, the communist utopia, classless society, by then supposedly getting rid of property rights and making everything part of the public good, and having a dictatorship of the proletariat governing. And then since everything is public, right, and everything is managed publicly, then eventually you will transition into the communist classless utopia. Which they didn't understand is that if everything is in the control of the state, it's not in the control of the people, it's in the hands of the people that control the state, right, and manage the state.
And the problem is that humans are a bunch of greedy bastards when it comes down to it.
Yeah, exactly. And that's one of the things. And there is no wonderful state of nature like that. Like this is like a modern bastardization of the Garden of Eve idea, right? In our tradition. And this is the thing, like modernity and the Enlightenment thought, they just took our ideas and they gave it like a modern coding, and then they're like, aren't we geniuses, right? So that's, to answer your question, that's what they're after. They're after, so all the evils are a part of society. The thing though is that this is obviously like the result of some Rousseau was some urban moron, right? Who probably never had to like tilt a field, right, to get food. Because if you think, right, that like the fruits of the earth belong to everybody, right, and it doesn't take an immense amount of effort for you to grow corn, because I come from an agrarian background. I come from my family's they were farmers, right? From my great grandparents and stuff like that, and I've tried and I have grown corn in summer with my family and stuff like that. And I can tell, like, I've been working all day and stuff like that to get corn. If some random douchebag just came up and took up the corn as the fruits of the earth that belong to everybody, I'd be freaking pissed, right? And so obviously, like, this idea was written by somebody in the city in modern times who never had to go outside, and touch grass, apparently. So this is the thing, like, and this is why it's so popular now, because since we're so urban and we live in this very sheltered, controlled environment, people, they lose track of how things kind of really are. This is why you have the stereotype of the conservative redneck, right? The conservative guy in the rural area, and the guy in the city who thinks that this artificial bubble is how things naturally are, and so that's the thing. So I hope I answered your question.
No, quite thoroughly. That's. I mean that again, like you said, that it's not. There's no really any new ideas, right?
Yeah.
We want freedom, right?
Mm-hmm.
And when we say freedom, we mean the ability to do whatever I want, whenever I want, with no one to tell me otherwise, which goes all the way back to the tree in the center of the Garden of Eden. Right? Like this has been a circle for, this has been existent for basically for as long as there have been humans on this planet.
And it leads to the paradox of freedom.
New repackaging.
And it leads to the paradox of freedom, which I believe, I could be wrong, but I think, I'm not sure, but I think Socrates gets into the paradox of freedom in Plato's Republic. I'm not sure. But the paradox of freedom is basically if you're free to do everything, then you're free to enslave others, right?
Yep.
Which means that for freedom to prevail, then there has to be an authority that limits people's freedoms so that it doesn't allow people to enslave each other. So, for instance, if Johnny puts Billy in his basement and imprisons him there, then a bigger authority, the government or the state, who's legitimate, should then imprison Johnny, for imprisoning Billy, right? So Johnny should have his freedom taken away for taking Billy's freedom away, right? So freedom has to be limited to save freedom from itself. That's the paradox of freedom. And how do you save this paradox? Well, it's quite simple thing. I have my solution is, you don't define freedom as a freedom from authority, right? A freedom from limitations, a freedom from duties or anything like that, because that just leads to the paradox of freedom, which means it's a logical contradiction, right? It's a dead end. Yep. But you still can have freedom if you define freedom as dispensation, right? As a license that a benign authority gives to you. That way, you then connect the definition of freedom to a benign authority, right? That then has the duty, if it wants to be a benign authority, it has to give you license and has to give you room and space to breathe, right? So if you then define freedom as dispensation, you then, as a consequence, you define what a good benign authority is, and you get rid of the tyrannical ruler, and you also guarantee room and space for the individual to be him or herself and to be free, right? While if you define freedom as the freedom to do whatever you want, in contrast to an authority, right, freedom from authority, that necessarily leads to tyranny. Because, like I said, it spirals down into the paradox. If you're free to do everything, then you're free to enslave others. And you don't really have and this definition doesn't really guarantee a benign authority. It puts you in opposition to authority. But it also allows you to it makes you free to become an evil authority if you want to, if you define freedom in this really broad sense, right?
Yep. So the limiting factor that I typically place on freedom when you talk about what does it mean to be free is not so much that we can free to do whatever we want, but we should be free to do whatever we should. Mm-hmm. Right. Yeah. So freedom is not just a lack, like you said, it's not a lack of authority, it's a lack of oppression, essentially, right? A lack of something preventing us from living as we ought to live.
Because there's many good options, right? You can choose, there's whole good things that you can choose from, and freedom is choosing one good option to another good option. But freedom is not choosing the bad option. So, like, okay, do you want to be a dentist, or do you want to be a doctor, or do you want to be a policeman? Those are good options. Do you want to be a mafia boss? That's when things get, dicey. Yeah. I think that this, going back to, and now let's take this back to the male and the male characters and female characters, because I think there's a good segue here, and then we can close out, because I think we've been talking for a couple hours, I think, at this point. And I'm pretty sure you have to go to sleep. So that's what you see with characters like Captain Marvel, right? Her problem was that she had this authority that was keeping her down, was keeping a good woman down. And her character arc is just breaking free from these constraints and then shining like a firework or whatever, right? And being able, willing and able to do whatever she wanted. Of course, you do have moral constraints, but it's not that she's constrained by morality. It's that she's just naturally moral, right? So it's not that. So this is like the whole thing. Like the reason why, going back to that article, you get rid of the so-called pre-modern corporate totalitarian fascist dystopia from Thomas the Engine, right? By making the white Sir Topper Hatterman guy a woman, right? That is enough to. Sorry, I lost my train of thought here. Sorry, this happens sometimes.
This is why we write scripts for videos.
Yeah, this is why I write my scripts as well. But yes, so like that's why you just all you have to do is change the tyrannical man with the woman, because evil is in society itself. It's not freedom to do whatever you want can never really be a bad thing. It's just the constraints of society that creates all the injustices. So yeah.
Yep. And yeah, when you don't have, any sort of moral struggle in a central character whose arc is supposed to be the defining, story beat, the narrative is going to fall flat. Mm-hmm. Right? And there's a big qualifier there, and that in a main character whose arc is driving whose arc is driving the narrative, it's okay to have characters who don't have that same sort of arc, because their arc is not the driving force of the narrative. For example, at least in the novel, Faramir is a very much almost perfectly virtuous character. Mm-hmm. He doesn't have the same sort of struggles that Frodo and Sam do in going through the story, because he's in a very small part of it. And he stands out in contrast to Boromir, who is very much tempted by the ring, whereas Faramir has the established virtue to say no to the thing. Like, I forget the exact line, but he says, he essentially says, "Not in a million years would I ever touch that thing."
I think he says, "I would not pick up if I saw that thing in the wayside." I think that's what he says, but I'm not sure.
Yeah. Something incredibly beautiful that I can never come up with, but Tolkien said. And so so you have characters like that, and he's very much a paragon of virtue. And there's a big difference between paragons of virtue and characters who are perfectly capable, right? Who can just win the day by being who they are, if only society would stop holding them down. See, Captain Marvel or 2020's Mulan for reference. And that's why those movies fell so flat, is because that's not really a character arc, and also because I think when you write characters like that, they're just naturally going to be boring. I mean, Captain Marvel had all the personality of a blank plank of wood, and I've seen more chemistry in just a flat glass of water between her and Nick Fury. That movie was just so blah. So yeah, that's the problem you have when you want to have replace. You can't replace Superman with Captain Marvel, because you kind of lost sight of what Superman wants to do, which is just like his inherent desire to just save people, not be all he can be.
Would you like to end the video on talking about examples of good female characters? Because I think we talked about male characters, and I think we've just been crapping on how female characters are written terribly in the culture now. Would you like to to discuss briefly good female characters and even modern examples, I think, because although a lot of stories right now are terrible and Disney has made a lot of crappy stories, there's still some good newer ones that came out. A good example is Encanto.
Oh, yeah.
Like I really liked Encanto. Like what was your example? What was your opinion of Encanto? Did you like it? Because for me, I have a Latino background. I'm Latino, and I love that. I love that film. I thought that I don't really care about representation or anything like that, but I thought that film, they definitely had a bunch of Latinos on it while making that film, because that's very much how a Latino family is. And I think the character of Mirabel is a great example of a good female character. And I think Abuela as well. I think she's also a strong female character. And I think she's also a good person, even if she has some. But what's your opinion on that film?
I think I've only seen the movie all the way through once. I've heard the songs, goodness knows how many times, because my kids like them. But I think I've only seen the movie once. And I agree. I liked the character, especially Abuela's character, was really compelling, where she's very much like she's in charge, she's in control, but she's struggling and she's suffering, and she has to accept that she needs help. And I think that's a really good, really good thing to show, because so many mothers, right, are like that, where it's just like, I have to be enough. And it's like it's okay. You are, but also you need help, and that's wonderful and that's beautiful. Everyone's here to help you and love you. So I did really like that. I don't remember Mirabel's character terribly well, but I definitely don't remember disliking her in any way. So yeah, I liked Encanto, and it's definitely one of the few highlights of Disney from the last decade. Yeah. As far as other female characters that I really love, obviously Toph and Katara. And Suki too. Pretty much anybody from Avatar: The Last Airbender is going to be on that list, because they're all different, for one thing. They all have journeys that they go on. They all really care about other people. They have to, especially in Toph's case, learn how to care for other people. I mean, Toph is a great example of how independence is not just being free to do whatever you want, right? It's the ability to be allowed to do what you should do. She has to learn to be part of a team and everything. And despite being, having her newfound and, long desired freedom. So I love those characters. Vi from Arcane, I think is a phenomenally written character.
Arcane is a great example of a story it's a progressive story. It's written by progressives. And Vi, she even has that haircut, right? That I like making fun of. But
Vi's like definitely a lesbian.
Yeah, exactly. But and we're two Catholics, and we like that character. Like we like the Arcane. Like this is the magic of universal storytelling. Is like even if you're a progressive, if you're able to tap into to the universsul story, or to these universal elements, you can reach across the political divide, I think, and you can still have your story, and you can still have your message.
Because what is Vi's defining trait? Like, what is her driving factor? What is her driving force?
She wants to defend her sister. She wants to defend her family. Yeah.
It's just love for Jinx and for her father figure, or for Vander, her friend. It's like it's not
it's a human story.
Her.
Exactly. It's not about her. It's a human story. And even though she's aggressive, like that's not a good thing. Like it doesn't paint her overly aggressive, toxic side as a good thing. Like it gets a child killed. Right? Her attitude, her toxic, aggressive attitude gets a child killed. Right? In the end. Yep. And then Jace, he like her excesses kind of corrupt him a little bit and makes him commit like a terrible mistake. And then he has to kind of back off from that. Like that's what story should be. Like you have conflict between characters. You have and you have the character itself goes on. Why is the whole Captain Marvel thing? Why is she terrible? There is no character development, right? If the character is already fine, there is no journey for us to go on with the character. And as a result, we don't connect to the character. We connect with Vi because she has a journey. She has issues that she has to work out within herself, right? So when we start complaining, like even though you and I are obviously like we're two Catholic white guys, like I'm Latino, but I'm a white Latino. But even in that case, even though we are like, I don't know, like the fascist Satan or whatever it is, in a lot of these narratives that these people like to believe in, we can still completely appreciate their stories and they can appreciate our stories, like the Lord of the Rings that everybody likes, no matter your political stories unite.
Which is a very Christian Catholic work, no matter what some people may try to tell you.
Exactly. Just as Arcane is very progressive. But we can all still get behind the story. We can also appreciate the story. Because it talks about the human condition. Yeah? Go ahead.
Good storytelling will win out, and will, if you have some universal value about, humanity, right? So, something that people will relate to across the ages, you're going to win hearts. You're going to get you're going to get your story to resonate with people, no matter, how different your views may be. And I think that's really, really cool. And that's why I liked talking about stories like Arcane, or I made a video recently about Kratos from the new God of War games. And I know like the developers there in California do not share my ideals. My values. I don't expect them to, but we clearly share some. And there's a lot of really wonderful elements. And this is where I have a huge problem with people labeling one thing or another woke and just like discarding it entirely. Yeah. Because it's people do that on both sides. They call it woke, or they call it fascist or racist, or any whatever label you might slap onto something, is because it's just discarding something wholesale for what may or may not be a small part of it,
and just for politics, which is annoying.
But just for clout, just for people, just for retweets on Twitter. And it's like, how about we engage with the story, engage with the content, see what is good and beautiful in that, and talk about that. You can talk about what's also not good and beautiful. Right? There's plenty of stuff to criticize, and fair game. But this is why I love talking about these stories. Because there is good and beautiful stuff within every human mind, and when they put that on paper and then they put it into a computer, they shoot it, they edit it, they put out a story for us all to see. That's really, really cool. No matter how much I may agree or disagree with whoever was behind that production. And also it's important to remember that, these people creating these stories do largely have, at least I would hope, have some differing views. And I a lot of the time, people do all seem to have the same opinion in Hollywood because, like you said, they just jump on the modernity train as opposed to actually thinking for themselves. But, a diverse set of people made these stories, and a diverse set of people will view them and play them or whatever, and being able to find the common elements that we all get out of it, that's really awesome.
Having diverse elements within a universal story is also necessary. You do have to have some differences because you have to impart some. We have to learn through a story as well. Like we have to go on a journey with the character, because if we also don't change while experiencing a story, then what was the point of the story, right? The character goes through an arc, and we go on that arc with the character. We change with the character. That's why stories are such important, if it's done correctly. That's why stories are so important as a way for transmitting a message. And that's why, of course, it becomes very easily politicized, because it's such a potent way to make people change. Right, because a story is only good if it changes you. But if the idea is that you don't have to change, you're fine the way you are, then the character doesn't change and you don't either. And so you also feel kind of cheated of a story. Like, you promised me a journey. Where's the journey? There is no journey. But you talked about how people complain about the woke stuff all the time. I think that's actually a better point for us to end this conversation, because I've been called the fascist, but I've been called the leftist, leftard, libtard as well. Exactly. So like we're on the both sides, right? We're leftist fascists. We're libtard progressive fascists, right?
I'm all over the political spectrum, depending on who you ask.
Exactly. Me too. I
got called a child of Satan on Twitter.
That's what
that was fun.
That's why
I've been called it.
Why are you on Twitter? Like, I'm not on Twitter. I'm not, like, I have a Twitter account, but I never like Twitter makes everyone into a douchebag. Like, including
it really
me.
Does.
Including me. Like, I become a douchebag on Twitter. That's why I don't go on Twitter. Like, I don't want to be a douchebag, right? So that's why I avoid Twitter. But because like I'm kind of sick of there's a female. Like, I made a video about Eowyn. And there's a lot of guys that I would agree with on a lot of political stuff, but they were going on like, no, Tolkien was wrong. Like, you can't have a woman with a sword, right? That's subversive and stuff like that. It's like, bro, like, the warrior maiden is an ancient literary archetype. Like, what are you talking about? So people, this is like the problem with the whole, when people focus on political things, on just, they get fixated on these things and they lose the bigger picture to the point that they even go against they even don't make any sense within their own political ideas. So for instance, from the progressive side, we're doing something new. We're creating a woman with a sword. Like has been done since ancient times, right? Since Athena, right? Or like even before her. Or like you go from the other side. Like a woman can never like have a sword. She has to like just be a perfect wifely, feminine figure, which serves as a propaganda for childbearing. It's like, okay, I can agree that the mother, and I say this in my video a lot of the times, is a criminally underappreciated archetype now, which we have to rediscover and we have to value again. I agree with that. But the idea that a woman can't be anything else from that is also not true even within your own tradition. So you're being anti-traditional, right? And you're being against your own traditions, right? If you believe that. Because no matter where you're from, there is a warrior maiden in your lore. Whether you're Chinese, right? Whether you're in Latin America, whether you're in North America, no matter where you're from, in your traditional stories, there's a female warrior. So, yeah. So I guess the problem with a lot of these stories is the problem with the whole progressive stories is that you can see is that they have contempt in them, like we said before. It's not that they have a woman who's a strong character. When you see a story like Arcane, there is no contempt for the male characters, so we can all get behind. We can all enjoy the character. We can all enjoy the characters in the stories. Yeah, yeah.
They're not, they're not propping up one at the expense of the other, right? Which is what a lot of modern stories do. It's they very much lean into like this ridiculous battle of the sexes, where it's like. We have to prop up men, or we have to prop up women, or one or the other, and it's just you got the feminists, you got the anti-feminists, and they're all just fighting this battle, and it's like, could you just not?
Yeah.
We don't have to do this.
And the problem is we all lose if we do this. And the reason why we all lose, because if everything is woke, then you're going to be woke eventually. Like if you prop up this culture of calling everything woke, you're going to be called woke if you say something that somebody somewhere thinks is woke.
Oh, I've been called, like, people, been like, don't go woke because I said the word sexist. I mentioned that Sokka was being sexist because he literally says, like, there's no way a bunch of girls take us down. If that, I don't know what else to call that other than being sexist. Because he's a 16-year-old boy. Of course he's kind of sexist. Like, that's, and I made this point in that video, it's like, that's kind of the state of being a 16-year-old boy, especially in a society like the Southern Water Tribe. It's just, it's so interesting where people just, they get, for lack of a better word, they get triggered by, by certain words or phrases, or, you put the words toxic masculinity in your video and you'll get a whole lot of people telling you that toxic masculinity isn't real. It's just made up by the, the femcells or whatever.
No, but
and
it's like, it's a real thing.
And it's just like, well, okay, I see. What you mean to say is that toxic masculinity is a vastly overused term to describe anything vaguely masculine and maybe vaguely right-wing leaning, which I would agree with, that it's incredibly overused. But also, men are capable of being douchebags. Men are frequently douchebags, and calling that toxic masculinity is not really incorrect. It's just not the nomenclature that you would prefer.
Toxic masculinity is the corrupted version of masculinity. So it is possible for masculinity to have a dark side, right, that you have to avoid. But there's also a bright side, a good side to masculinity, which you have to accept in yourself. Because as a man, you have that inherently in you. Right. And just as you have toxic femininity, which we don't talk about enough, but that's also like a thing. But yeah, so like calling everything fascist, or calling everything like the satanic panic and stuff like that we kind of like. What's funny, J.K. Rowling, I think, is a great example of like just how the culture has been everywhere. Because there was a time, right, when she made Dumbledore gay kind of out of nowhere. And then everybody was criticizing the evangelical soccer moms that were like not liking that at the time, right, in the early 2000s. And she was like this progressive messiah at the time. But then she decided not to go on board the train with the trans issue. And now she's a fascist. Now she's been called a fascist by Harry Potter stars, by actors and actresses, right, that were acting in her stories. And this just goes to show that like nobody wins, no matter what side you're on, right? the same way that you've been called a child of Satan, even though like you're Catholic and you're trying to do what is right by what you believe, and the same thing. And I've been called a leftist libtard, even though I very much identify with the other side of the political spectrum, very more traditional thinking. But it's not about labels. It's not about being quick to try to point fingers. Like we really do have to address the ideas and discuss the ideas. And if they're valid or not, it's by their own merit, I think. Because otherwise, you're not discussing the idea, you're discussing the person. And but it's not just about discussing the person. What you're really doing is you're putting the person in a box that you're imprisoning the person in a box. And then in that way, you are shutting yourself off from what they have to say. And that hurts you. And that hurts you. Because in a society, we learn from each other, no matter where we're from. And I think you have to have the courage, I think, to just be willing to see a different perspective, I think. And just be confident enough in your beliefs to know that that's just because there's a different perspective, that's not going to harm you or necessarily sway you. And if there's something to be learned from there, you can learn from. If there's something that you have to condemn, sometimes you do have to condemn certain ideas. You have to do that as well. But we need a civil space for us to discuss these ideas, I think. Sorry,
absolutely.
Again, with the script.
No, I mean, you need to be more comfortable. We all need to be more comfortable. I definitely include myself. Like, my wife is far better about this than she will listen to, podcasts and stuff that, she's like, I know I'm not going to really agree with everything this person says. Right? She's really good about just like exposing herself to other ideas. And that's really something I really admire about her. And we all need to be more like that, where it's like, I'm going to listen to these people because I might agree with them on some things. I know I'm not going to agree with them on others. And that's just how I am going to, it's one of the ways I'm going to grow as a person, as I'm going to, think about the things they say. And I may not disagree with it, but I'll think about why I don't disagree with it. And, what do I really believe in this matter? The other thing, I think this is incredibly important, is something that people just don't realize at all, or don't want to believe, but it's very much still true, especially, in movies and TV and video games and everything, is that people whom you strongly disagree with and, idealistically, are still very much capable of making good art. I think that's something, I haven't really talked about that in the video, but it's something I'll bring up at some point. I don't know. Depending on what, where I want to get to, whether I talk about that with like Arcane or maybe with God of War series or something. I don't know. But that's something that I feel like people just, they don't want to believe that. They don't want to believe that if you are, a modern progressive, that you are capable of, making a good story because you're too focused on DEI. And a lot of the time they are too focused on checking other boxes or doing or social messaging and injecting themselves or their very much modern, postmodern ideals into the story to actually write a good story. That is very much true. That happens. But also sometimes, things are quote unquote woke, just to throw the term out there, however you may define that. But they're still good stories, right? They're still told cleverly and creatively, and they still have universal elements within them that are valuable.
Yeah. And the ability to find the universal in these things helps bridge the gap. Because then if everything made from the other side is, if they're only enemies, right? That has terrible broader implications. Right, because if we can't talk to each other, then we have to fight. Right, so being willing to see different perspectives in a story, right? But also being willing to hear my opinion. Like, you can make your story, but if I think it's a crappy story, then I have to be free to say it's a crappy story without being called the fascist. Right. Yeah. So on all sides, I think, and people have this idea that in the Middle Ages and stuff like that, that was prohibited, and the idea of a free conversation is something that came out of the Enlightenment. It's not true. The quodlibeta, it was this medieval concept of a discussion that theologians would have in universities, right? Which the university itself is a medieval creation, and it's precisely this space for free thought where all ideas were able to be discussed, and even ideas like whether God is good or not, like is God actually evil? They would actually discuss this in medieval universities, and then they would conclude through logic that no, God necessarily cannot be evil. What I'm saying is that there's a rich tradition, right, in the West for having a space for conversations and debates. And just because we are quote unquote modern or postmodern, just because we're living in the current year in 2024, I almost said 2023 now, but just because we're living in the current year of 2024 does not mean that we necessarily will always have this. Doesn't mean that we'll always move forward, and it doesn't mean that we'll always have this safe space to talk to each other. We can, if we're not careful to how we think, if we're not careful in how we demonize each other, we can lose this tradition that has been with us, with letting each other talk and giving space to different perspectives. And throughout history, because I think history moves in cycles, people periodically lose that, and then it comes back because it always proves to be necessary. And I think we're just losing that now. I'm just saying this in a long-winded way to just because you're called a fascist, don't do the same thing in calling everything woke. And just because you're called woke, don't call everything fascist. Don't be afraid. Don't be afraid, right? And try to focus on what makes us on the universal truths that we're all connected to, which is what the progressives like to think as well. Like they like to say, like deep down we're all the same. Now, I don't like how that's worded. I think that that's not exactly true. It's not that we're all the same.
Mm-hmm. No, we're all very much, fearfully, wonderfully made unique.
But we're all connected. Individual. We are all connected. Yeah. We're not all the same, but we're all connected, which is not the same thing, but it is something for us to think about, for us to realize that there's something better than just trying to ostracize each other. And we can learn that in stories.
Absolutely.
So thank you very much, Master Samwise. How long have we been talking? Let me see.
At least an hour and a half, I think.
Yeah, I think probably something like that. Man, thanks for showing up. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks for getting up early and getting this going.